Cut to the Chase Sports Podcast, bringing unique insight analysis behind your favorite teams. I'm your host, Chase Shantz. Got a special guest in the house today. He's on his way up to Chicago, calling the St. John's DePaul game. Matt Schumacker. What's on, Matt? What's up?
Thanks for having me, brother. Appreciate you letting me tune in from the car. Hopefully you can hear me all right, but I'm glad to be on the pod. And by the way, I love the name. Cut to the chase. That's good. It's a good play on words.
I appreciate it, man. We just celebrated our 3-year anniversary on Sunday. So just, excited to get back at it and appreciate you coming on. You do a lot of work for a lot of different companies. I believe ESPN, you got Big Ten Network, Fox. Is there any other that I'm missing at the moment? Because there's a lot.
You know what? In the past, when I was especially a little bit younger and freelancing even more, there was I had another 10 people that I was working for, various teams, conferences, minor league baseball, what have you. But at this point now, it's pretty much those three: Fox, ESPN, and Big Ten Network, which of course is owned by Fox. They're the majority owner of Big Ten Network.
All right. And again, Butler graduate. Give us a little background about yourself, Matt.
So I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. Wound up at Butler. Interestingly, it was never really on my college radar. I'd never even heard of it, honestly. And but I really wanted to run track in college, and I wasn't good enough to run at like a major state school. So I was looking at smaller D1s. And I started talking with the Butler coach kind of late in the recruiting process. They invited me up for a visit, which coincided with the Final Four in Indianapolis, in which Butler was playing. It was the first time they'd ever made the Final Four. They lost to Duke in the Natty that year. But I was on campus, and it was crazy. There was tons of buzz for the basketball program. And, ESPN was all over the place because Butler was the darling of the big dance. And I just loved the vibes there. So I ended up going to Butler. I ran track. I studied journalism. And that's kind of how I ended up there and why I'm back in Indianapolis now, just because I fell in love with the city when I was a student there. Moved back in 2018 after 4 years after I graduated, met my wife, who's from Indy. And now we live there with our 2 kids.
That is awesome, man. That is a wholesome Hoosier story right there. That is great, man. And the funny thing was, me and my one friend who's on the show a little bit here, and then Ben Conn, we were talking about that Butler Duke national championship game. Gordon Hayward would have made that shot. I believe it was Matt Howard that set the screen. That would have been. I just always replay that back, and I'm like, man, he leveled whoever the heck that was. That goes unnoticed though, because obviously Gordon Hayward missed the shot. But man, that was a heck of a run for Butler that time.
Dude, that shot was this close.
Oh,
and that was my senior year of high school. I'll never forget. At that point, I had decided that I was going to go there. So like maybe it was like the week before that I did my visit, and then I was like, okay, I'm going to go to Butler. And so I was back home in St. Louis watching the national championship game with my dad, like rooting as if I was a Butler student. And oh man, it was so fun. And you're right, had that shot gone in, first off, I don't think anybody in the world would have expected Butler to make it to the Final Four that year. Obviously, I think they were an 11 seed or a 9 seed. But to do it in the city in which your campus is located, 5 miles from campus, and you play Duke to a 1-possession game, that city would have been on fire had that shot gone in.
Seriously, and it feels like, I mean, obviously maybe not in Indianapolis, but it feels like around the country that kind of goes unnoticed. Like, it's the fact that Butler made it, but the fact that they played in their hometown is insane. That, and then the fact they make it back the next year and they're now, Big East foe UConn. So I mean, so your freshman year, Butler was able to make the national championship once again down in Houston. But I mean, that had to be a crazy time to go to college, man.
It was a crazy time. I'm super grateful for that experience, just because I would assume it's probably like that at any school, but when you're the underdog, I think it makes it that much more special during March Madness. And also, it was just like, how is this happening again? It was so surreal, to see the team do it again, and then, living on the same floor as a couple of the freshmen who were on the team. It was fun just having that personal connection to the team too, and getting to watch your friends make a run through the NCAA tournament. And then a couple of my buddies and I actually drove down 17 hours in a two-door sports car. There was four of us, from Indianapolis to Houston.
Wow.
We stayed in some terrible motel. We're a broke college freshman,
Yep.
but it was an experience I'll never forget. Just because when you're 18 years old, you don't need lavish accommodations. It's just, how do we get there and how do we get in the game, and we'll figure the rest out once we're there. And it was a great time.
Exactly. And then everything else outside of that is a story to tell at a bar or something. You know what I'm saying?
100%.
Oh, that's awesome, man. But we'll take a drive down I-74 and go to Cincinnati, man. So Cincinnati, Xavier, I know you've covered, both teams, at least a game or so for both. We met at the Cincinnati and Texas game, which you were on the call for. And what a game that was, with Max Aismith hitting the game-winning jumper. It was a strikeout night at Cincinnati, crazy. And then I believe you've done a couple Xavier games. Have you done a couple of Xavier games this year? The past, is that right?
Yeah, I actually did the crosstown shootout this year, as a matter of fact.
I didn't even notice that. Oh,
yeah.
Wow. Oh, jeez.
It was amazing. Yeah,
100%.
It was my first year doing it. And, growing up in the Midwest and loving college basketball ever since I was a kid, that was a series that I always watched. Now, I didn't know the deep competitiveness and the sort of in-city rivalry that it was, because I was not familiar with the city of Cincinnati when I was a kid. I'd never been there before. But once I started working for Fox and seeing that game on Fox, every other year, I started to realize just how special that rivalry was. And so when I got that assignment this year, I had it circled. I was so excited to do that game, and it lived up to the hype. It was a tight game the whole way, and the Xavier fans were like camped out for 24 hours before. It was special. It was fun to do.
Most definitely. I got a lot of friends that actually go over to Xavier, even though I go to Cincinnati, but they were telling about the whole experience and everything. And, it goes back to UC at Fifth Third Arena next year. So I'll be excited to be in there and try to cover the event. But man, I mean, that again was a big game for both teams. Xavier was struggling out of the gate, and Cincinnati was undefeated at the time. And Xavier was able to, just stick it to us. But I will, say, overall, Xavier's had a bit of a rougher season this year. Not the way they wanted things to go. They've had like a completely new team compared to last year after the Sweet 16 run. But just overall, what were your thoughts on Xavier as a whole this year? Just kind of the letdown that's going on right
now. I think I've done like 6 or 7 of their games this year, and I think they were one post player away from being a guaranteed NCAA tournament team. And had Jerome Hunter and Zach Fremantle both been healthy, I would have said they're a second weekend team, because their guard play is elite. Desmond Claw, Davion McKnight, and Quincy Oliveri, who's now leading the Big East in scoring, has been just an electric big three, but they lack experience in the post. And they've had their front court this year, the guys who are available, having to play in much more significant roles than they anticipated. And I think that's evident over the course of the season when you've got, all first-year guys at Xavier, but some of them have never played college basketball before. They're true freshmen. And in today's era of college basketball, particularly in the Big East, where it's a get-old, stay-old league, it's really hard to compete night in and night out with freshmen, especially in the low post, because the Big East is such a physical league. But, I think Xavier's one of those teams that in so many of the games that I've called where they haven't come out on the winning side, they've been 2 or 3 possessions away from changing the course of the game. And in those situations, Chase, I just feel like, man, if they had one more player like Zach Fremantle or Jerome Hunter, some of these games go the other way. Like I did the Houston Xavier game, they lost 66-60. Couldn't have defended Houston better. But they went the last few minutes of the game without really any offensive continuity, and it ended up hurting them. And you just think, man, if you had an anchor in the post that could catch it and get you a bucket when you need it, maybe that game changes.
Most definitely. And yeah, I mean, again, that, I know it's evolved into a spacing game, and we're looking at guard play, and that's going to be a big thing in March, but looking at guard play and kick out and living and dying by the three. But it does go to show that having a consistent post threat does go a long way when things aren't going well from the outside. You have that reliability on the inside, and with Xavier, having to go up against Donovan Clingan, and you got Iso Igudaro, and then Kalkbrenner from Creighton. I mean, that's a tough matchup for anybody in the country. So, and I know you saw Kalkbrenner last week, I believe.
Well, Chase, you bring up a really great point, which I think is a nuance of the college game that doesn't get discussed as much. I actually think the game changes a little bit when you get into March Madness. I'm talking the NCAA tournament. And you talked about spacing, guard play. I think guard play in the NCAA tournament is even more important than it is in the conference season. And the reason for that is in the NCAA tournament, a lot of times you're having two teams that have never seen each other. And when you get to the second game of the weekend, you literally have 24 to 36 hours to prepare a scout for that team. And because traditionally guards have the ball in their hands more than anybody else, it makes sense that the guards would have an even more impact in a game where there's such a short turnaround. And I think elite guard play in the NCAA tournament is why teams make a deep run. Obviously, post players are important, but I think if you look at some of the big upsets that we've seen in recent years, like Fairleigh Dickinson beating Purdue, Fairleigh Dickinson's guards outmatched Purdue's guards that year that Fairleigh Dickinson won. And I think having guards that are quick, can break you down off the dribble, obviously can hit threes, because the three is the great equalizer in college basketball. But in conference play, you see each other all the time, twice a year in the Big East. It's a true round robin, and the scout is out, so it requires, I think, more depth in terms of offensive options. And because of the physicality of the Big East, I think post play is super important. I think the same could be said for the Big 12. I mean, you look at the depth of the Big 12 this year. They legitimately can get 9 or 10 teams into the big dance, which is crazy. And until last week, Cincinnati was still on the bubble with a 500 record and a below 500 record in conference play, if memory serves me correct, listening to Joe Lunardi talk. So that in and of itself shows you, how difficult that league is. But I just thought that was an interesting point that you made, kind of about the spacing of the floor, hitting the three-point shot, and sort of that nuance once March Madness comes around.
Most definitely. And like you mentioned with the Big 12, I mean, I think right now it's the best conference in college basketball, and I think
easily.
And it's insane with them, with adding Houston and Kansas obviously still being a great team, and Baylor, BYU's been really good, and Texas Tech has been here and there, and TCU has been on the rise. There's so many other teams that I'm probably forgetting at this point, but I'll stick with the city in Cincinnati. But they play Oklahoma tonight, 8:00, ESPN Plus. They got a huge win against Kansas State this past Saturday, much needed. But it's just been a very weird year where this team has lost so many close games inside of 10 points. And, they've gone on the road and they've beaten some teams, like mentioned BYU when they were, number 12 in the country. And they beat Texas Tech when they were number 15. And, they gave Houston somewhat run for their money on the road last week, but more run for their money, when they played the first time. But it's just, I don't even know how to put this Cincinnati team like in the words and stuff. And I know you covered the Texas game, but even a month back or 2 months back, what did you see from that Cincinnati team?
I think, and Xavier, you could lump Xavier into this category. When you have that many close losses, in my opinion, it comes down to experience in that position. So for Cincinnati, yes, they returned some players from last year, but they were in a different league. Now it's the Big 12, and it's a 1-point game against Texas with a minute to play, or it's a 2-possession game against Houston with 3 minutes to play. Those game pressure situations that, with all due respect to the American Conference, which I think is a really good conference, but you just said it a minute ago, the Big 12 is the best conference in basketball, and I don't think anybody would argue with you on that point. It's just a different level. And I think what Cincinnati showed me is that they can compete at this level right now. And I'd be willing to bet next year they are even more competitive in the league, and I'd be surprised if they weren't an NCAA tournament team, just because I think Wes Miller's got something special brewing there, and I think there's a ton of support around the program from within the athletics department to make sure that they're competitive in the Big 12.
Most definitely, and he got a contract extension not too long ago. They're getting some higher recruits in, being in the Big 12, and what Wes Miller's trying to do with Cincinnati basketball. So I'm excited to see what happens next year, and I'm excited to see how it finishes this year. Because if there's any time of year to get hot, it's right now. So we'll see what goes on.
And I still think there's a path for them. Call me crazy, but I think there's a path for them to make the NCAA tournament without winning the Big 12 tournament. Obviously, they probably got to make the Big 12 tournament semifinal at least, maybe even the final. But I don't think that's out of the question either, because they've shown that they can compete against some of the top teams in the conference. And when it comes down to single elimination basketball and one team has nothing to lose and the other team does, you never know what can happen. And I would put Cincinnati in they have nothing to lose category, because right now they're not really in the conversation. But that can change over a 7-day stretch, and they can put themselves in the conversation by winning a handful of Quad 1 games.
It definitely could, and what better place to win Quad 1 games in the Big 12? And their road continues tonight against Oklahoma. But we'll move on here. So there's 3 teams, I would say, and I think a lot of people would say, that have been playing the best college basketball this entire season. And maybe I'm leaving out a team like Tennessee or whatever, but Houston, UConn, Purdue. What team jumps out at you the most out of those 3?
Man, it's tough. I've seen all 3 this year. Purdue multiple times, Houston once, and UConn once. I think what jumps out to me about Houston is their relentless effort on both sides of the ball for the entire 40 minutes of the game. And that is really, if you haven't been prepared for that, like a lot of teams won't have been prepared for that in the NCAA tournament, I imagine it would be startling, because calling their game at Xavier this year, it was the first time I'd seen Houston in person, and it jumped out to me. I knew the style that Kelvin Sampson, wanted his team to play, and I knew how gritty their guards were. Shed and Cryer, in my opinion, might be the best backcourt duo in the country. Certainly, they're up there in the Big 12. But seeing them in person and how tenacious they are, they're a tough out. UConn, I think, is just so incredibly balanced. I think Cam Spencer is one of, if not the best, portal pickups in the country, and has just so perfectly slotted into Dan Hurley's system at UConn. And then, you've got Tristan Newton, who's a Big East Player of the Year caliber player. You've got Stephon Castle, who's probably a lottery pick. And then Donovan Clingan, who's a terrific big, who I think just continues to get better. And if he does come back next year, I think he's a candidate for Big East Player of the Year. And then Purdue. Purdue dominated every game I called of theirs this year. It was a 20-point game with 10 minutes to play. I think the thing that stands out to me this year about Purdue is that their guard play has taken it to another level. And I think a big reason for that is their transfer from Southern Illinois, who I'm forgetting his name at the moment.
I will get on that. I'm blanking on him too.
Yeah, help me out.
He's obviously he's been a huge impact. Like
huge.
Yeah.
Jones, I think is his last name.
Let me get there really quick. But yeah, huge impact though from their guard play with Lawyer and Braden Smith coming up, but Lance Jones being the guy. Lance Jones.
I think he's up there with Cam Spencer in my opinion, as far as best portal pickups in the country. I think Matt Painter, he only brought in one transfer this year, and it's Lance Jones. And Lance Jones has been a perfect fit for Purdue. So that's kind of what stands out to me for all three of those. I think Braden Smith is playing at an All-American level. His jump between freshman and sophomore year has been huge for that team, and I think it'll show really in the NCAA tournament, where so many people just sort of expect Purdue to be disappointing. I don't think they'll be disappointing this year. I mean, it's so hard to get to the Final Four. That is a really hard thing to do, because you could be one of the best teams in the country, but for whatever reason on that one night you don't match up great with the team across from you and they hit 17 threes, your season's over. But I think Purdue is a second weekend team this year, and then after that, it's a toss-up.
Yep. At that point, once it gets to that second weekend, it's like, well, may the best man win on that.
It's a roll of the dice.
100% roll of the dice. But yeah, you mentioned Braden Smith, 7.1 assists per game and only 2.7 turnovers. So he's, balling right now, and all three of those teams having great guard play. So it's going to be fun to see what happens going forward.
It's a great point.
Oh yeah,
they all have elite guard play, and they all have. I would say maybe with the exception of Houston, they have a dominant post presence. Houston is a little bit more. They spread you out a little bit more. They don't have a 7-footer in the paint, but they do have, like JoJo Tugler, I think, is a really good freshman. There's another post player for them who's I'm spacing on, who played well in the Xavier game that I had back in December. But I think they're a very complete team. They're also top 15 in the country in both Ken Pom offense and defense, with their defense being number one. And there aren't a lot of teams that can say that. In fact, I think right now there's 10 teams in the country who are in the top 25 in both, but Houston's the only team, or maybe one of two teams, who's in the top 15 in both. I think they're a tough out in March.
Oh, 100%. And again, Jamal Shedd, LJ Cryer, those guys, it's almost like they play. It's almost like Houston's offensive identity has some type of defensive toughness. It's really weird and odd to put it, but you just watch them, and you've obviously seen them up close. You just know.
Yeah.
But it is something. But I will say, we'll move off the top teams. I want to hear a dark horse team or teams for March, in your opinion.
So I think Creighton is a dark horse. Now, some people might say, well, they're top 15 in the country, and, you're right. But I think a lot of people were not sold on Creighton early in the year because they lost Ryan Nembhard and Arthur Kaluma to the transfer portal. Stephen Ashworth wasn't playing his best basketball after transferring in from Utah State. He's flipped the script on that. They have elite guard play. They also have a very, very good big in Ryan Kalkbrenner, who has now played in 2 or 3 NCAA tournaments, including the Elite Eight last year. And I think, they bring back 3 starters from the Elite Eight team last year. I think they're an Elite Eight team again this year. And, if the ball bounces their way this season, they're in the Final Four. So they're one of my dark horse teams. And then I think South Florida. I've had them a couple times this year, including a home win against Florida Atlantic, which was a big, big win for that program. They ended up getting ranked for the first time in program history after that win. They are now more loudly, but in the middle of the season, they were quietly the best story in college basketball. I think now they are definitively one of the 2 or 3 best stories in college basketball, just given all that they lost. Brand new coach, 1 returning starter in Selton Miguel, who's now coming off the bench this year, in a show of just total humility. But I think they've won 13 or 14 games in a row. And if they make the tournament, watch out. Because I think they have a special thing going where they don't have necessarily a superstar chase, but they have a lot of guys that play well together. And in March, that means a little bit more.
Definitely does. And I'm excited to see what happens with those teams, especially a team like Creighton, who was there last year, and they lost on heartbreak with being foul shots and everything. Excited to see where this whole month goes, especially, and obviously we talk about March Madness, but the conference tournaments. I mean, we get a lot of great stories and some upsets from there and buzzer beaters. So I'm very excited to see that. But again, Matt, appreciate you coming on. I'll let you run here to Chicago, but man, it was definitely fun talking. Definitely got to do this again.
You too, brother. And you and I share the same sentiment. March is my favorite time. And that 2-week run of the NCAA tournament, I'm pretty much glued to the TV in my living room. And if my kids want to watch something else, too bad, because it's the only TV in the house.
Gotta love it, man. And I'm a huge NFL fan, but even I say March is the best time of year, man.
So good.
It is so good, man. But yeah, I'm gonna let you run, man. But I appreciate you coming on, and we'll see you guys next time.